This is not a work of fiction. This is the staggering, contradictory, and almost unbelievable true story of Archduchess Elisabeth Marie of Austria, the only child of a doomed crown prince, the favorite granddaughter of the legendary Emperor Franz Joseph, and the last direct descendant of the main Habsburg line. History would give her a title far more shocking than her Imperial Highness. It would call her, with a mixture of awe and contempt, the Red Archduchess. Born into society's highest pinnacle and the heart of a dynasty, she would later betray everything she inherited. This wasn't a simple family disagreement, but a complete and total rejection of everything she was born into. She chose to trade the crown for a red flag, the scepter for a picket sign, and dedicated her entire life, her fortune, and her sacred name to an idea that was the literal antithesis of her existence, the single goal of destroying the very system that created her. To her friends and comrades, she was a hero. To her family and the aristocracy of Europe, she was the ultimate traitor. Her life became history's what if, tragedy and rebellion, meeting the collapse of an old world and the birth of another. And to understand how this princess became a revolutionary, we must begin with the gunshot that defined her entire existence, a shot that rang out in the Vienna woods before she was old enough to even understand what death was. Her entire life was an answer to a question asked by a ghost. The story begins, as so many Habsburg tragedies do, with her father, Crown Prince Rudolf. Rudolf was not just any heir. He was the hope of the sprawling, decaying Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was the only son of the unyielding conservative Emperor Franz Joseph and the ethereal, tragic, and famously beautiful Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi. Unlike his rigid, tradition-bound father, Rudolf was a man of the modern age. He was a scientist, an ornithologist, a writer, and a passionate liberal. He saw with painful clarity that his father's empire was a splendid anachronism, a multi-ethnic prison of nations that was being torn apart by nationalism and social inequality. He believed in progress, in science, in constitutional monarchy. He secretly wrote anonymous liberal pamphlets, fiercely criticizing his father's government, pleading for reform before it was too late. He was his mother Sisi's son, restless, intelligent, melancholic, and utterly unsuited for the suffocating, ritualized world of the Habsburg court. His father, Franz Joseph, distrusted him. He saw his son's liberalism not as foresight, but as weakness, as a dangerous echo of the 1848 revolutions that had nearly cost him his throne. To rein him in, to force him into a conventional life, the emperor arranged a marriage. The bride was Princess Stephanie of Belgium, a woman who, while royal, was considered blunt and plain by the sophisticated Viennese court. Their marriage was a disaster almost from the start. It was a cold political union, and Rudolf, trapped and despondent, fled into a life of heavy drinking and desperate affairs. From this toxic, unhappy union, only one child was born on September 2nd, 1883, a healthy, beautiful baby girl. They named her Elisabeth Marie, but she was known to the family simply as Erzi. Erzi was the light of her father's life. He adored her, perhaps seeing in her the only pure, uncomplicated thing in his increasingly dark world. He called her his little rogue, and she inherited his sharp wit and rebellious streak. For 5 years, she was a princess in a fairy tale, albeit one with deeply unhappy parents. But the fairy tale was about to end, replaced by a gothic horror story that would haunt Europe for a century. By 1888, Rudolf was a broken man. He was politically sidelined, riddled with venereal disease from his affairs, addicted to morphine, and consumed by a fatalistic depression. He had fallen into a passionate, obsessive affair with a 17-year-old baroness, the beautiful and infatuated Mary Wetzera. Theirs was a death pact, a romanticized love suicide that Rudolf had apparently proposed to other mistresses who had wisely refused. Mary, young and fixated on a Wagnerian grand exit, agreed. On the 30th of January, 1889, at the Imperial Hunting Lodge of Mayerling, the act was done. The exact details are still debated, shrouded in mystery and a frantic court cover-up. The most accepted version is that Rudolf first shot his young mistress, sat with her body for hours, and then, as dawn broke, turned the gun on himself. He was 30 years old. The news that hit the Habsburg palace was not just a tragedy, it was a constitutional crisis and a spiritual catastrophe. The heir to the throne, the hope of the dynasty, was dead, and he was a suicide. The court's reaction was one of pure, unadulterated panic. The Emperor Franz Joseph, a man whose entire identity was built on duty and the unflinching image of the monarchy, was shattered. His first instinct was not to grieve, but to control the narrative. The public was first told that the Crown Prince had died of a heart attack. This lie lasted less than a day. As the truth began to leak, the story was changed. But the problem of a Catholic burial remained. Suicide was a mortal sin. The emperor's men frantically pressured doctors to declare Rudolf mentally unbalanced at the moment of his death, a loophole that would allow him a state funeral. Mary Wetzera, the 17-year-old girl at the center of it all, was treated with appalling cruelty. Her body was smuggled out of Mayerling, bundled into a carriage and propped up between her uncles. A cane stuck in her dress to make her look alive so no one would suspect what had happened. She was buried in secret in a corner of a village cemetery, her name erased from the official story. And what of 5-year-old Erchi? She was now in effect an orphan. Her beloved father was gone, a name suddenly spoken only in whispers. Her mother, Stephanie, was now a pariah at court. She was blamed for failing to keep Rudolf happy, for failing to produce a male heir. She would soon be almost entirely exiled from her daughter's life, remarrying and moving away. The Mayerling incident was not just a distant news story for Erchi, it was the traumatic amputation of her entire childhood. With her father dead and her mother ostracized, Erchi's life was placed into the hands of one man, her grandfather, the Emperor Franz Joseph. This was the hinge of fate. She was taken from the relative warmth of her own nursery and placed under the direct, unbending supervision of the crown. Franz Joseph, heartbroken and now even more rigid in his beliefs, saw in his granddaughter the last precious remnant of his lost son. But his way of protecting her was to encase her in the amber of Habsburg tradition. He was determined to raise her as a proper Archduchess, to purge her of any of her father's dangerous liberalism, to mold her into a perfect, dutiful, and silent symbol of the dynasty. But the emperor made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he could control her. He thought he could erase her father's influence. He failed to understand that by isolating her, by surrounding her with the cold, hypocritical rituals of a dying court, he wasn't creating a symbol of loyalty. He was forging a weapon. He was planting the seeds of his son's intellectual rebellion in the fertile, traumatized soil of his granddaughter's heart. Erchi would grow up with a burning, unspoken resentment, a quiet, simmering rage against the very system that had in her mind broken her father and stolen her childhood. She would spend the rest of her life finishing the war her father had started, not with his liberal pamphlets, but with a revolutionary's fire. That rebellion was inevitable. It was born in a cage, an empire crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled. the magnificent ancient world it was born from, and the modern brutal world it refused to join. This was the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the turn of the 20th century, a magnificent, sprawling, and deeply troubled entity. It was a colossus with feet of clay, a multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the sophisticated cafes of Vienna to the rugged mountains of Transylvania, from the spires of Prague to the sun-baked ports of the Adriatic. It was home to 50 million people, a bewildering mosaic of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, Slovenes, Romanians, Italians, and more, and all of it. This entire teeming, fracturing world was held together by the will of one man, the man who was now Archie's sole guardian. Emperor Franz Joseph was not a man. He was an institution. He was a living relic, a bridge to an almost forgotten age. He had ascended to the throne in 1848, the year of revolutions, a moment of fire and chaos that had nearly destroyed the Habsburg monarchy. That trauma had forged him. He was not a cruel tyrant in the mold of an Ivan the Terrible. He was far more complex. He was a micromanager, a bureaucrat-in-chief, a man who saw himself as the first servant of the state. His personal life was a litany of unbearable tragedies. His brother Maximilian had been executed by a firing squad in Mexico. His wife, the restless Empress Sisi, lived a life of nomadic wandering, estranged from him and the court she despised, until she herself was assassinated by an anarchist in 1898. And then his only son Rudolf was lost at Mayerling. Through all this, his response was not to change, but to endure, to retreat deeper into the rigid shell of duty and tradition. He woke every morning before 5 a.m., worked at a simple desk in a plain soldier's uniform, and governed his vast empire as a meticulous, unfeeling administrator. He despised change. He saw liberalism, nationalism, and socialism as existential threats, as forms of chaos. His entire philosophy was to resist the modern world, to hold the line, to keep the ancient traditions alive. And the heart of this tradition was the Hofburg Palace. This was the world young Erzsey was thrown into. The Hofburg was not a home. It was a machine. Life within its 2,600 rooms was governed by a set of rules so ancient and complex it was known simply as the Spanisches Hofceremonial, the Spanish court etiquette. It dictated everything. How you dressed, how you walked, how you bowed, who could speak to whom, who could enter a room first, who had to back out of a room. It was a system designed to elevate the imperial family into a semi-divine status, to separate them entirely from the real world. This was Erzsey's nursery. This was her schoolroom. She was raised in gilded isolation at Laxenburg Palace, just outside the city, under the watch of strict governesses, with tutors chosen by her grandfather. She was taught languages, history, music, and the complex genealogy of her own family, but she was starved of affection. Her mother, Stephanie, was a rare and formal visitor. Her grandmother, Empress Sisi, was a mythical absent figure, perpetually traveling, who, on her rare visits, reportedly found the young Erzsey to be a strange and intense child. Her only consistent family presence was her grandfather, the old emperor, a man who loved her in his own distant, dutiful way, but who was emotionally incapable of providing the warmth a traumatized child so desperately needed. Erzsey grew up in this opulent vacuum. She had everything: silk dresses, priceless jewels, private tutors, ponies to ride, and yet she had nothing. She had no parents, no confidants, no friends her own age. She grew up with a sharp, observant, and deeply cynical mind. She saw the hypocrisy of the court, the fawning of the aristocrats, the rigid class divides. She saw the thousands of servants who kept the imperial machine running, living in starkly different conditions, and she felt an intense, burning empathy for the underclass, for those on the outside. It was a trait she shared with her dead father, Rudolf. The more her grandfather tried to force her into the mold of a perfect, silent Habsburg princess, the more her father's rebellious blood boiled within her. And outside the palace walls, the world her grandfather was so desperate to hold back was exploding. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dying, and everyone knew it, but the emperor. The primary threat, the cancer eating the empire from within, was nationalism. The dual monarchy, established in 1867, had made the Hungarians partners, giving them their own kingdom and parliament. But in doing so, it had enraged every other ethnic group. The Czechs in Bohemia demanded the same rights. The Poles in Galicia, the Croats, the Serbs, they all simmered with resentment, dreaming of their own nations. The Balkans, in particular, was a powder keg, with neighboring Serbia actively funding nationalist groups within the empire's borders. Franz Joseph's only solution was to divide and rule, to play one group against the other, a desperate game that was rapidly running out of time. And then there was the internal threat, right in Vienna itself. While the aristocrats waltzed in palaces and the new industrial barons built the magnificent opera houses and museums of the Ringstrasse, a new, exploited working class was huddled in squalid, overcrowded tenements. Vienna was a city of grotesque contrasts, a place of immense wealth and desperate poverty, and into this fertile ground, a new, powerful idea had taken root: socialism. The Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria was gaining hundreds of thousands of followers, organizing strikes, demanding universal suffrage, and arguing for the complete redistribution of wealth. While Franz Joseph worried about nationalism, his own capital city was becoming a global center for a different kind of revolution, one that saw kings and emperors not as rulers, but as parasites. This was the world that needed to change. The Habsburg monarchy was an antique relic in a world of steel, electricity, and mass politics. It was clear to everyone, to the intellectuals, to the nationalists, to the socialists, that the old system was failing. It was suffocating innovation, crushing equality, and dragging its 50 million people towards a catastrophic war. A new voice was desperately needed. Crown Prince Rudolf had been that voice. He had been the one hope for progressive reform, the one man who understood the need for change, who wanted to federalize the empire and give its peoples a voice. His death at Mayerling wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was the death of hope. It was the assassination of peaceful reform. With Rudolf gone, the empire was now on a collision course with destiny, piloted by an old blind emperor. Into this vacuum stepped his daughter. Elisabeth Marie, ere she, was now the living embodiment of this central conflict. She was the granddaughter of the old guard, the man who represented the iron past and the daughter of the lost hope, the man who had died for a different future. She was trapped, isolated and simmering with a rage she didn't yet understand. The stifling court, the ghosts of her past, and the revolutionary energy of the city just beyond her palace walls were all mixing within her, creating a chemical reaction. She could not be the docile princess her grandfather demanded. Her father had tried to save the empire by reforming it from within. Ersey, seeing what that had cost him, would soon choose a far more radical path. She would decide to burn it to the ground. As Elisabeth Marie, or Ersey, grew from a traumatized child into a young woman, the gilded cage of the Hofburg began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. The woman who emerged from this crucible was not the docile, pious, and submissive princess her grandfather, Emperor Franz Joseph, had intended to create. Instead, the court was faced with a creature It simply did not understand. An intellectual, a skeptic, and a firebrand, all wrapped in the package of the empire's most eligible bachelorette. She was, in every way, the polar opposite of the old guard she was meant to represent. Her grandfather was stoic, predictable, and wedded to duty. Erzsé was passionate, impulsive, and allergic to protocol. She was a living contradiction. She possessed the famous ethereal beauty of her grandmother, the Empress Sisi, but she utterly lacked Sisi's melancholy, escapist romanticism. Sisi fled from the court she hated, disappearing for years on end, losing herself in poetry, obsessive exercise, and the cult of her own beauty. She was a butterfly who refused to be pinned. Erzsé was not a butterfly. She was a wasp. She did not flee. She confronted. She stayed. She watched. And she judged. She had a mind that had been sharpened to a razor's edge by her isolation. While her tutors followed the emperor's approved curriculum of languages, Habsburg history and etiquette, Erzsé, like her father Rudolf, conducted her real education in secret. She devoured books, literature, philosophy, and, most dangerously, politics. She read the very newspapers and pamphlets that her grandfather's censors were trying to suppress. She saw with a clarity that terrified her handlers the gaping, unbridgeable chasm between the world presented to her, a world of divine right, aristocratic virtue, and imperial destiny, and the real world just beyond the palace gates. She developed a searing disdain for the hypocrisy that surrounded her. She would be forced to attend lavish state dinners, sitting for hours, watching the high aristocracy, men and women who were famously decadent, unfaithful, and often cruel, perform their elaborate rituals of piety and loyalty. She saw how they fawned over her grandfather and then mocked his rigid simplicity behind his back. She saw how they treated their servants as subhuman, as invisible furniture. This, more than anything, ignited her fury. Her empathy, born of her own loneliness, extended naturally to the other people trapped in the system, the footmen, the maids, the stable hands. They were her first unconscious allies. Her defiance was not yet political. It was personal, and it was constant. She refused to play the part of the delicate royal flower. She became an expert horsewoman, riding astride like a man, not side saddle, and she rode with a reckless abandon that terrified her attendants. She became a crack shot, a master of firearms, just like her grandmother Sisi. But for Sisi, it was a diversion. For Erzsé, it felt more like a preparation, a channeling of her inner violence. She was known for her sharp wit, a sarcastic, biting intelligence that often left fawning courtiers speechless. She was, in short, a proto-feminist in the most restrictive patriarchal environment imaginable, a woman who demanded agency in a world that allowed her none. To her grandfather, the emperor, this was not just a personality quirk, it was a problem. She was the Mayerling blood showing itself again, that same rebellious intellectual and unstable streak that he believed had destroyed his son, Rudolf. At 8.4 thousand views, the emperor was a man who solved problems with the only tool he knew, tradition. And the traditional solution for a restless, problematic, and dangerously intelligent archduchess was to anchor her to the system with the heaviest weight possible, marriage. A suitable husband, he believed, would settle her down. A husband would give her a proper role, that of wife and mother. A husband would end her dangerous flirtations with ideas and ground her in the realities of dynastic duty. The search for this safe man began. Erzsé, for her part, was briefly infatuated with other, more romantic figures, but her grandfather was taking no chances. He would not allow a marriage to some charismatic, intellectual, or liberal prince who might encourage her tendencies. He wanted a man who was the living embodiment of the old guard, a man who was wealthy, loyal, uncomplicated, and utterly, thoroughly, and boringly conventional. He found his man. His name was Prince Otto zu Windisch-Graetz. Otto was on paper the perfect imperial son-in-law. He was handsome, charming, immensely wealthy, and from one of the most ancient and loyal aristocratic families in Austria. He was an officer in the army, a man who understood horses, hunting, and the simple hierarchies of the world. He was everything Erzsi was not. He was intellectually shallow, politically conservative, and perfectly content with the world as it was. He was the safe royal life she could have chosen, a life of wealth, titles, lavish parties, and absolute conformity. He was, in essence, the very system her grandfather wanted her to marry. He was her living foil. When the match was proposed, Erzsi was horrified. This wasn't a man she could talk to. This wasn't a partner. This was a warden. She fought it. She pleaded with her grandfather. She raged. She despaired. This was, to her, the ultimate betrayal. Her grandfather wasn't just arranging her marriage. He was sentencing her to a lifetime of intellectual and emotional solitary confinement. But the emperor was immovable. This was not a request. It was an imperial command. Her duty to the dynasty came before her personal happiness, just as his had. In 1902, at the age of 18, Elisabeth Marie, the granddaughter of the emperor, walked down the aisle. The wedding was the event of the decade, a glittering spectacle of Habsburg power. Kings, archdukes, and princes from across Europe filled the pews of the Hofburg chapel. But for Erzsi, it was a funeral. It was the death of her freedom, the final brutal slamming of the cage door. The marriage was a disaster from the first night. It wasn't just a mismatch. It was a collision of two different species. Otto was a simple aristocrat. He expected a beautiful, docile wife who would manage his household, look admiringly at him, and provide him with heirs. What he got was a chain-smoking, book-reading, sharp-tongued intellectual who questioned his every word and clearly despised him and the world he represented. He was bored by her intellect, and she was repulsed by his lack of it. He, in turn, did what men of his class and time did when faced with an unsatisfactory wife. He simply went elsewhere. He was a notorious womanizer, and he barely bothered to hide his constant flagrant affairs with actresses, singers, and other society women. To Erzsi, this was not just a personal humiliation. It was the ultimate symbol of the system's hypocrisy. The man who represented tradition and loyalty was, in private, a faithless degenerate, and the system allowed it. It protected him. But Erzsi was not her mother, Stephanie, and she was not a long-suffering victim. She would not sit in her palace and weep. She was her father's daughter, and she was her grandmother's granddaughter. She would retaliate. And her retaliation would be so shocking, so violent, that it would nearly bring the monarchy to its knees for a second time. If Otto could have his affairs, so could she. She began a series of her own, scandalizing the court. But these were not just flings, they were acts of war. She chose men who were unsuitable, who further alienated her from her husband's circle. And in doing so, she pushed the already unstable marriage toward its breaking point. This brings us to 1904. The marriage is a hollow shell. Erzsi is consumed by rage. Rage at her husband. Rage at her grandfather. Rage at the trap her life has become. Her husband Otto is carrying on a very public affair with a popular Viennese actress named Missy Jaeger. The gossip is everywhere. Erzsi, the granddaughter of the emperor, is being made a fool of. One night, this lifetime of contained, pressurized fury, the trauma of Mayerling, the loneliness of her childhood, the humiliation of her marriage, finally, terrifyingly, exploded. The details are murky, buried by a century-old imperial cover-up. But the story that leaked out and became a legend of the court is this. Erzsé, learning of her husband's rendezvous, took a pistol, a weapon she was an expert with. She tracked the actress down. Some versions of the story say it was at her apartment. Others say it was in Prague. In a fit of jealous, uncontrollable rage, she confronted her rival. Shouts were heard, and then a gunshot. The actress was wounded, some rumors even whispered killed. The exact truth of what happened in that room is lost to history, but the result is not. A shot had been fired in anger by the Archduchess Elisabeth. A commoner had been harmed. It was a scandal of unimaginable proportions, a Mayerling in miniature, as it involved yet another Habsburg, a woman, and a violent, passionate crime. The full weight of the empire's machinery of secrecy came crashing down. Emperor Franz Joseph was incandescent with fury and perhaps terror. This was the exact kind of Mayerling blood he had feared. He intervened personally. The Habsburgs closed ranks. The police reports, if they ever existed, vanished. The press was silenced. Missy Jaeger, who was wounded but not killed, was paid a fortune for her silence and sent away. The story was officially disappeared. But for Erzsé, this was the moment of crystallization. This violent, impulsive act, this dark secret, revealed her to herself. It showed her the blue blood entitlement still within her, a capacity for violence that horrified her. But even more horrifying was the cover-up. The system she hated, the system that preached morality and law, had just effortlessly erased her crime. She learned in that moment that for the Habsburgs, there was no law. There was no accountability. The entire structure was a lie, a rotten facade. The cover-up, designed to save the monarchy's reputation, was the very thing that destroyed Elizabeth's last shred of loyalty to it. It was the catalyst that completed her radicalization. Her marriage was now a war zone. She and Otto lived in the same palace, but as bitter enemies. She was trapped. The Catholic Church and the Emperor would never grant a divorce. She could not escape. So she retreated. But this time, she wasn't just retreating into books. She was retreating into an idea. She had 4 children with Otto, 3 sons and a daughter. But even motherhood couldn't contain her. Her rage and humiliation now had a focus. She was no longer just a rebel. She was looking for a weapon. She was looking for an ideology that could explain this rotten world and an ideology that could end it. And she found it. In the cafes of Vienna, in the forbidden pamphlets, in the passionate speeches of the men her class called traitors and rabble-rousers. She found the works of Karl Marx. She found the platform of the Austrian Social Democratic Workers' Party. This wasn't a casual hobby. This was an epiphany. Socialism to her was not an abstract economic theory. It was a moral answer. It gave a name to the injustice she had seen her entire life. It explained the hypocrisy of the aristocracy. It explained the exploitation of the servants. It explained her father's despair and her grandfather's blindness. It offered a vision of a new world, a world built not on blood and divine right, but on equality, on workers' rights, on the redistribution of the very wealth that she and her useless husband possessed in such obscene quantities. Her vision became clear: radical equality, the complete dismantling of aristocratic privileges. She began to use her status and her immense personal wealth not as a shield, but as a sword. Clandestinely, she began to build her shadow court. This time, her allies were not fawning aristocrats. They were the most dangerous men in the empire. She cultivated relationships with intellectuals, labor leaders, and prominent figures in the Social Democratic Party. One of these figures, a rising intellectual named Dr. Karl Renner, who would one day become the first chancellor of the Austrian Republic, became an ideological guide. She would host intellectual salons at her palace, a perfect cover for what were, in reality, secret political meetings. The Archduchess Elisabeth, granddaughter of the Emperor, was now secretly meeting with the very men who were publicly calling for the end of the monarchy. And she was doing more than meeting. She was funding them. She used her enormous imperial allowance to secretly finance socialist newspapers, to support strike funds for workers, to pay the legal fees of arrested labor leaders. It was the ultimate irony. She was siphoning off the empire's own gold, the money of the old guard, and using it to forge the weapons of the revolution. By the dawn of the 1910s, Erzsé was living a profound double life. To the public, she was still Archduchess Elisabeth, the beautiful, if difficult, wife of Prince Otto von Windisch-Graetz, mother to 4 children, and a glittering figure at court. But in secret, she was a committed socialist, a comrade, a revolutionary patiently waiting in the wings. She was a mole, hidden in plain sight, deep inside the very heart of the imperial family. She was no longer just the mold breaker, she was the empire breaker. And she knew, with the same certainty her father had, that this entire glittering, rotten, magnificent, and doomed world was about to end. The year 1914 was approaching. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was planning a trip to a city called Sarajevo. The world was on the brink, and Elisabeth Marie, the Red Archduchess, was ready. She was waiting for the fall. The world that Elisabeth Marie, Erzsé, had been patiently waiting to see crumble did not just crack, it exploded. The assassination of her cousin, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in June 1914, was the spark that lit the global powder keg. Her grandfather, the ancient Emperor Franz Joseph, in one of his last and most fatal acts of governance, was persuaded to sign the declaration of war against Serbia. Within weeks, the web of alliances had dragged all of Europe into the most catastrophic conflict humanity had ever known. The Great War had begun. For Erzsé, this was the ultimate, horrifying vindication of her beliefs. This, she knew, was not a war of patriotism. It was a war of kings, a cynical, pointless slaughter orchestrated by the very aristocratic and military class she despised, with the working class of all nations as its cannon fodder. But her position was now more precarious, and her internal conflict more profound than ever before. She was still, in name and law, Archduchess Elisabeth, wife of Prince Otto von Windisch-Graetz. Her husband Otto was a high-ranking officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, immediately called to active, glorious duty. Her grandfather was the commander-in-chief, the symbol of the entire war effort. She was, by her very identity, a pillar of the war machine. She was trapped, forced to play the part of the patriotic royal. Publicly, she performed her duties with a cold, robotic efficiency. She was seen at fundraisers for war bonds. She lent her name to charities, and she even served as a patroness for a military hospital. The court and her husband saw a dutiful, if famously chilly, princess. But privately, behind this mask, the revolutionary was raging. Every casualty list, every newspaper report filled with patriotic lies, every letter from the front deepened her conviction. She saw the empire she hated devouring its own children, sacrificing millions of poor conscripted men, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, for its own senile vanity. Her double life became a razor's edge. Her secret meetings with socialist contacts became more dangerous, bordering on treason. The party she supported, the Social Democrats, was itself split, with some supporting the patriotic defense and a more radical wing condemning the war entirely. Erzsé aligned with the radicals. She allegedly used her status to pass information, to protect socialist dissenters from the secret police, and to funnel money to anti-war efforts. She was a spy in her own home, a double agent in her own life, praying for the defeat of her own grandfather. Then, in the midst of this global inferno, the old world finally died in its bed. On November 21, 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph passed away at the age of 86. He had ruled for 68 years, an almost geologic span of time. The man who was her jailer, her guardian, her grandfather, the living symbol of the 19th century, was gone. Erzi's last personal emotional tie to the monarchy was severed. She reportedly attended the funeral with a dry-eyed, unreadable expression. The crown passed to his grandnephew, the young, gentle, and deeply tragic Emperor Karl I. But everyone knew it was an empty inheritance. They were crowning a ghost. The next 2 years were a death spiral. The war was lost. The multi-ethnic empire, starved, bled white, and filled with mutinous soldiers, was fracturing at the seams. Soldiers were deserting by the tens of thousands. At home, the population was literally starving. The infamous turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 had seen the Viennese, once the best-fed citizens in Europe, reduced to boiling turnips and subsisting on bread made of sawdust. Revolution was not just an idea, it was a physical necessity. In October 1918, it happened. The entire imperial structure collapsed almost overnight. One by one, the crown lands declared their independence. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, the new states of the Slavs. It was a domino effect of liberation. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Karl I, facing total societal collapse and revolution in the streets of Vienna, renounced participation in state affairs. He didn't technically abdicate, he just acknowledged the monarchy was over. The next day, November the 12th, 1918, from the steps of the Parliament building on the Ringstrasse, the very boulevard built as a monument to imperial glory, the Social Democratic leader Karl Renner declared the Republic of German Austria. For the old aristocracy, it was the end of the world. It was Armageddon. They fled, packing their jewels into suitcases, trying to escape to Switzerland, their world of privilege and power dissolving in an instant. But for Elisabeth Marie, it was not an end. It was the beginning. This was not a defeat. It was the game-changing victory she had been waiting for her entire adult life. The cage was broken. The old men were gone. The hypocritical, suffocating, rotten world of her youth had been swept away by the tide of history. And the men who were now in charge, the Social Democrats, the men her grandfather had called traitors and gutter snipes, were the very men she had been secretly meeting with, funding, and supporting for years. Erzi, the granddaughter of the last real emperor, was now one of the most powerful and well-connected people in the new socialist Austria. The mold breaker was about to become the nation builder. The immediate post-war years were pure chaos. Austria was a tiny broken remnant of a vast empire, a head without a body. There was hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and desperate hunger. The old guard was gone, leaving a vacuum. Into this vacuum, Erzi made her move. She did not flee with her aristocratic relatives. She did not retreat into obscurity. She did the most shocking, decisive, and public thing imaginable. She joined them. In 1921, she formally registered as a member of the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria. This act cannot be overstated. This was not like a celebrity endorsing a candidate today. This was the granddaughter of the last emperor, the last direct line Habsburg, publicly, legally, and spiritually joining the party of Karl Marx. She was turning in her passport to 600 years of history. Imagine the scene at the party headquarters in the Favoriten district, a working-class stronghold. In walks this woman, still carrying the poise and bearing of an archduchess, a figure they had only ever seen in newspapers, and asked for a membership card. There was suspicion, of course. Was this a trick? A tourist revolutionary looking for a new thrill? But her credentials were good. The party leadership, men like Karl Renner and Otto Bauer, knew her. They knew she had been a secret ally, a comrade, for years. They embraced her. And with this single act, she made her second decisive move. She publicly renounced all Habsburg claims. She dropped her titles. She was no longer Her Imperial Highness Archduchess Elisabeth Marie. She was simply Genosin Elizabeth. Her first act as a free citizen was to declare war on her own past. She immediately filed for divorce from Prince Otto von Windisch-Graetz. Under the old empire, this was impossible. A Catholic aristocratic marriage was for life, sanctioned by both emperor and pope. But under the new secular republic, divorce was legal. This, however, was not an amicable separation. It was a brutal, public, and protracted legal war that would drag on for years. Otto, the embodiment of the old guard, was apoplectic. He fought her with every legal weapon he had. This wasn't about love, it was about control, money, and most of all, the children. The custody battle for their 4 children was a vicious affair. Otto and the entire Austrian conservative establishment painted Erci as an unfit mother, a red, an atheist, a moral degenerate who was living in sin. And, in a devastating blow, they won. The conservative-leaning courts, still filled with old guard judges, granted custody of the children to Otto. Erci, the woman who had just helped liberate a nation, had lost her own children. It was a wound that would never heal, a bitter personal price for her public revolution. But this personal loss did not make her retreat. It made her double down. It severed her last ties to the old world. Now she had nothing left but the cause, and she was not alone. During her political work, she had become inseparable from a prominent figure in the Social Democratic Party, a man who was everything her husband was not. His name was Leopold Petzneck. Petzneck was a teacher, an intellectual, a committed socialist, and a former member of parliament. He was a man of the people, respected, principled, and deeply thoughtful. He had been her ideological mentor, guiding her through socialist theory. Now, he became her partner in every sense of the word. They fell deeply in love. It was a meeting of minds and souls that she had craved her entire life. She, the granddaughter of an emperor, and he, the son of a working-class family, began living together openly, a public scandal that flew in the face of Catholic conservative Austria. It was the ultimate final rejection of her past. Her transformation was now physical. She shed her aristocratic life like a snakeskin. She took her vast inheritance, the fortunes of the Habsburgs and the Belgian royal family, and began to systematically give it away. She didn't just fund the party, she became one of its primary benefactors. This was the era of Red Vienna, one of the 20th century's most ambitious social experiments. The socialist-run city was building a paradise for the people. Massive, beautiful public housing complexes like the Karl Marx Hof, public baths, libraries, clinics, and kindergartens, all for the working class. This was Erci's inheritance at work. The gold of the emperors was being melted down and reforged into bricks and mortar for the people. She and Petzneck moved out of her grand palace and into a modest bourgeois villa in Hütteldorf, a green middle-class suburb of Vienna. The press was fascinated, horrified, and obsessed. They followed her everywhere, and they gave her the name that would stick for the rest of history, Die Rote Erzherzogin, the Red Archduchess. She was now at the absolute peak of her influence. For the workers of Vienna, She was a living folk hero. She was the ultimate proof that their cause was just, so just that a princess had thrown away a crown to join them. When she appeared at May Day rallies, standing on the reviewing stand with Petzneck and the other party leaders, she was met with thunderous applause. She was a living symbol of the revolution, the triumph of socialism over the ancient monarchy. For the forces of the old guard, the aristocracy, the Catholic Church, and the rising conservative and nationalist parties, she was a monster, a traitor, the mad Habsburg, the final degenerate proof of the Mayerling curse. They saw her as a class traitor of the highest order, a woman who had spat on her father's grave and her grandfather's legacy. But she reveled in their hatred. It was proof that she was winning. Her villa in Hütteldorf became a counter court to the Imperial one. It was the new shadow court, but this time it was out in the open. She hosted salons for socialist politicians, Jewish intellectuals, progressive artists, and labor leaders. She was at the very center of the new Austria, a thriving, intellectual, and progressive force, proving that a princess could in fact become a revolutionary. For a brief, shining moment in the 1920s, it seemed her system had won. The world she had dreamed of was being built, and she was one of its chief architects. But the victory was fragile. The forces she had defeated were not gone, they were just regrouping, and they were mutating into something far more monstrous than the senile empire of her grandfather. The economic chaos of the 1920s, culminating in the Great Depression of 1929, poisoned the well. Political extremism exploded. In Austria, the socialists found themselves in an increasingly violent street war with the Heimwehr, a network of right-wing, anti-democratic, and virulently anti-Semitic militias, secretly funded by the very industrialists and aristocrats Irchi had betrayed. And just across the border in Germany, a failed Austrian artist, a gutter snipe named Adolf Hitler, was building a movement that fed on this same poison. The Red Archduchess had won her glorious victory against the past. But now, she and her newfound paradise of Red Vienna were trapped. They were besieged, caught in a pincer movement between a rising tide of domestic Austro-fascism on one side and the looming, terrifying shadow of the Nazi Third Reich on the other. Her greatest battle was still to come. And so, for a brief, shining, revolutionary moment in the 1920s, Red Vienna was a reality. It was a socialist paradise being built from the ashes of an empire, a city of the future. And at its symbolic heart was Comrade Elisabeth, the Red Archduchess, the living proof that the new world was not only possible, but just. She was a folk hero. She had won. She had defied her grandfather, avenged her father, and found her life's purpose in the arms of an intellectual soulmate, Leopold Petzneck. But history is not a fairy tale, and the victory was, in fact, a mirage. Paradise was built on a fault line, and the tremors were already beginning. The forces that would destroy her new world were gathering. But the most dangerous flaw, the central paradox that would haunt her entire life, was not external. It was internal. It was a contradiction she could never resolve, a ghost she could never exorcise. This is the heart of her story, where the public legend collides with the private, tragic truth. This was the central, biting paradox of the Red Archduchess. She could rally the masses against empires, but she could not conquer her own inner demons. She was a woman consumed by a quest for equality, who was by her very nature unequal. Her royal blood, the very thing she despised, was the source of her power. It was her name that made the newspapers follow her. It was her imperial inheritance that funded the housing projects. She was a socialist who had never, not for one day in her life, known what it was to be poor. This was the ticking time bomb of her own hypocrisy. While she and Petzneck lived in a modest villa in Hütteldorf, modest for an archduchess, was still a life of bourgeois comfort, complete with servants, a life utterly alien to the factory workers in the Favoriten district whom she championed. She was a class traitor, and this meant she was trapped, belonging fully to neither world. To the aristocrats she had abandoned, she was a degenerate, a traitor, a Bolshevik whore who had spat on her family's 600-year legacy. They whispered that it was the Mayerling madness, the cursed blood of her father, Rudolf, finally showing its true degenerate colors. She was an outcast, excommunicated from her entire class. But to the socialists she had joined, she was, to many still die, Rot Erzherzogin, the Red Archduchess. The title, meant as a compliment by some, was a subtle barrier. She was a comrade, yes, but she was not one of them. She had not risen from the proletariat. She had descended from the palace. Many in the party leadership, like Karl Renner, valued her immensely. Her money, her influence, her symbolic power were invaluable. But on the streets, among the rank and file, there was always a low murmur of suspicion. Was she just a tourist revolutionary, as her conservative enemies claimed? Was this all just a grand rebellious gesture, the ultimate acting out against her grandfather? Was she just a salon socialist playing at revolution in her comfortable villa? This isolation, shunned by the blues and never fully accepted by the reds, only amplified the personal demons of her past, the loneliness of her childhood, the trauma of her father's death, and the violent, impulsive rage she had inherited from both sides of her cursed bloodline. And this is where we must look back to the dark secret that the emperor had tried to bury, the ghost from 1904 that had never stopped haunting her. We must talk about the shooting. Years earlier, during her miserable first marriage to Prince Otto von Windisch-Graetz, she was a woman consumed by rage and humiliation. Her husband was a serial philanderer. His most public mistress was a well-known actress. The story, whispered in every salon in Europe and frantically covered up by her grandfather, was that Elisabeth Erzherzogin, a crackshot, had learned of a rendezvous. In a fit of jealous fury, she took a pistol, tracked the woman down, and shot her. The actress, Ms. Jaeger, was wounded, not killed, but the scandal was earth-shattering. The emperor himself had intervened, silencing the press, paying the actress a fortune to disappear and burying the entire affair. But the act revealed the fatal flaw at Erzherzog's core. When pushed to the breaking point, when her honor was challenged, she did not react like a 20th century socialist. She reacted like a 16th century feudal lord. She reacted with violence. She acted with the absolute terrifying entitlement of blue blood, the inherent belief that her rage gave her the right to pull a trigger and that her name would shield her from the consequences. And it had. The system she hated had protected her. This incident and its successful cover-up was the ticking bomb that had been under her life ever since. To her conservative enemies, it was proof she was unstable and mad. But to her, it was the ultimate source of her self-loathing. She knew what she was capable of. She knew that beneath the socialist theory and the comrade rhetoric, there was a core of Habsburg violence and aristocratic pride that she could not scrub out. This internal war, this paradox of her existence, culminated in the single greatest personal tragedy of her life, the loss of her children. When she finally filed for divorce from Prince Otto after the war, it was a declaration of freedom. But her husband, backed by the entire conservative Catholic establishment, struck back at her most vulnerable point. The ensuing custody battle was not a private affair. It was a public show trial of her entire life. Otto's lawyers painted her as a monster, an unfit mother, and they used her own revolution as the weapon. She was a registered socialist, an atheist. She was living in public sin with Leopold Petschek. She was, they argued, a moral degenerate who would poison the minds of her children, the grandchildren of Prince Otto, and the great-grandchildren of the sainted Emperor Franz Joseph. They even resurrected the whispers of her affairs, of her violent instability, of the 1904 shooting. Erzsébet fought back with all the fury of a lioness, but she was fighting a system that was still rigged against her. The judges were not her socialist comrades. They were old, conservative men who saw her as the living embodiment of the world's decay. In a devastating, soul-crushing verdict, the court granted full custody of all 4 children to Otto. It was a betrayal more profound than any she had ever known. The new republic, the new world she had helped build, had just stolen her children. It was a Pyrrhic victory of catastrophic proportions. Her children were raised by her hated ex-husband, steeped in the very aristocratic, conservative world she had tried to destroy. They would grow up alienated from her, taught to see their own mother as a radical, a stranger, a source of shame. This was the true price of her revolution. She had gained a new world, but she had lost her own family. She was, in the end, truly alone. This personal devastation, this profound betrayal, did not cause Erzsébet to retreat. It did the opposite. It cauterized her last remaining attachments to the old world. With her children gone, her rage and her political zeal became her only focus. She poured all of her energy, her money, and her soul into the cause. She and Leopold Petschek became leading figures in the Social Democratic Party's left wing. But the paradise of Red Vienna was now besieged. The external forces she had ignored were now at the gates. The Great Depression had shattered the Austrian economy. Unemployment skyrocketed, and in the fertile soil of this desperation, extremism flourished. The political arena was no longer one of debate. It was one of street brawls and paramilitaries. On one side, you had the Social Democrats, with their own powerful militia, the Republikanischer Schutzbund. On the other, you had the Heimwehr, a collection of right-wing, anti-Semitic nationalist militias funded by the very aristocrats and industrialists who had lost everything in 1918. And just across the border, in Germany, Adolf Hitler had taken power in 1933, and his Austrian Nazi Party was growing like a cancer. Austria was trapped. The socialist government of Red Vienna found itself in a pincer. The hubris of the socialists, Erzsébet included, was their unbending, zealous belief in their own righteousness. They saw the Heimwehr and the conservative Christian Social Party as their main enemy. They refused to compromise, alienating moderate conservatives who could have been potential allies against the real existential threat, the Nazis. In 1933, the conservative chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss saw his chance. Using a minor parliamentary crisis as an excuse, he suspended parliament, dissolved the Schutzbund, and declared all-out war on the Social Democratic Party. He began to rule by decree, creating a new, homegrown dictatorship known as Austro-fascism. For Erzsébet and Petschek, this was the nightmare returning. The monarchy was gone, but a new, more brutal form of the old guard had seized power. The Social Democratic Party was banned. Its leaders were arrested. Its newspapers were shut down. Red Vienna was now an occupied city. In February 1934, the final confrontation erupted. The Schutzbund, the socialist militia, rose up in a desperate, doomed act of resistance. The Austrian Civil War had begun. It was short and it was brutal. Dollfuss, in an act of staggering symbolic violence, turned the Austrian army's artillery on the Karl-Marx-Hof. The fortress of the people, the shining symbol of Erz's socialist paradise, was shelled by its own government. Within days, the uprising was crushed. Red Vienna was dead. The dream was over. The betrayal was total. This was the ultimate Pyrrhic victory. Erzi had helped tear down the monarchy, only to watch it be replaced by a one-party fascist state. The new government immediately rounded up its enemies. Leopold Petzneck, as a prominent socialist leader, was arrested and imprisoned. Erzsi, the Red Archduchess, was now a pariah in her own city. She was the most famous socialist in a country where socialism was now a crime. She was under constant surveillance by the secret police. Her bank accounts were frozen, her assets seized. She was powerless. Her political movement shattered, and the love of her life, her ideological anchor, was a political prisoner. She spent the next 4 years in a desperate, frantic, and courageous fight, not for a revolution, but simply for survival. She used what little remained of her international connections, her blue blood name, to pull strings, to send food and letters to Petzneck in prison, to try and negotiate his release. She was now a relic, as her enemies called her, a ghost of the Red Dream, reduced to petitioning the very fascist government she abhorred. But the Austro-fascist regime of Dollfuss and his successor Schuschnigg was itself a dead man walking. It was a weak dictatorship, squeezed between Mussolini's Italy and the ravenous, terrifying power of Nazi Germany. And Erzi, in her defiance, had made a fatal miscalculation. Her brave, hubristic refusal to compromise had made her an enemy of all right-wing factions. She had defied the Heimwehr, she had defied Dollfuss, and she had publicly, loudly, and repeatedly denounced the Nazis. She was, in their eyes, the ultimate symbol of Judeo-Bolshevism, a race traitor, a degenerate Habsburg who had sullied her Aryan blood. This was the apocalypse. March 1938. Adolf Hitler, a failed Austrian artist, had returned to his homeland as a conqueror, his armies marching into Vienna to the rapturous applause of hundreds of thousands. The Austrian state, which Erzi had first rebelled against and then helped to build, was erased from the map, swallowed whole by the Third Reich. And for Elizabeth, this was not a political defeat. It was a personal extinction event. The Gestapo had arrived with their lists. Her life's partner, Leopold Petzneck, was arrested and deported to the Dachau concentration camp. She was 55 years old. Her revolution was dead, its monuments shelled into submission years earlier. Her political party was banned, its leaders in exile or, like Petzneck, in concentration camps. Her children were long gone, alienated from her, living in the very aristocratic world she had disavowed. And now the love of her life was gone. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a Red Archduchess trapped in a city draped in black swastikas, her name at the top of every Nazi enemy list. The 7 years of Nazi rule in Austria were Elizabeth's long night of the soul. This was the ultimate test of her character. She was no longer a political player, no longer a comrade with a powerful party at her back. She was a pariah, a marked woman. She was under constant surveillance by the Gestapo. Her home was searched. Her mail was read. Her friends had vanished, fled, like many Jewish intellectuals she had hosted, or arrested, like Petzneck. And here, in this moment of total darkness, the greatest, most bitter irony of her life became her only shield. She was a Habsburg. The Nazis had a deeply contradictory, almost schizophrenic relationship with the old Austrian aristocracy. On one hand, they despised them as decadent, multicultural relics of a bygone era. On the other, they were pathologically obsessed with pure blood, lineage, and ancient Aryan names. They couldn't simply disappear the granddaughter of Emperor Franz Joseph, the last direct line Habsburg. It would be too complicated, too messy. So she was left to exist in a state of living death, untouchable but powerless. She was, in effect, a prisoner in her own villa, the Habsburg name that she had spent her entire adult life trying to destroy, now the only thing keeping her from a transport to Ravensbrück. Her life was reduced to a single burning purpose: survival. Not her survival, but his, Leopold Petzneck. She poured every last cent of her remaining non-seize funds. She pulled every last string of her old aristocratic connections. She wrote letters. She petitioned Nazi officials, not as a socialist, but as a Habsburg, using the very privilege she loathed, all in a desperate, frantic attempt to keep Petzneck alive. She sent packages of food and medicine to Dachau, packages that were almost certainly stolen, but she kept sending them. For 7 years, she lived on a knife edge of terror, waking every day to the fear that she would receive the official telegram informing her of his death from circulatory failure or exhaustion, the standard Nazi euphemisms for murder. She refused to collaborate. She refused to be a trophy for the regime. When Nazi officials approached her, hoping to use the Red Archduchess in some cynical propaganda, she met them with the same icy aristocratic disdain she had once shown her grandfather's fawning courtiers. She was defiant, silent, and unbreakable. She was no longer fighting for a revolution. She was fighting for a single human life, the only one that mattered to her. She was a woman waiting for the world to burn again so that she could see what, if anything, remained in the ashes. In 1945, the inferno finally burned itself out. The Third Reich, which was meant to last 1,000 years, collapsed into rubble after 12. Vienna was a smoking, shattered ruin, liberated and occupied by the 4 Allied powers. And from the concentration camps, the emaciated survivors, the ghosts of Europe, began to emerge. A message reached Elisabeth. Leopold Petzneck was alive. He had survived 7 years, first in Dachau, then in Buchenwald. He was broken, starved, and sick, but he was alive. Their reunion was not a grand, romantic spectacle. It was the quiet, exhausted meeting of 2 old, traumatized people who had survived the apocalypse. She was 62. He was 64. They had lost the best years of their lives. They had lost their revolution. They had lost everything except each other. In the immediate aftermath of the war, a new Austria, the Second Republic, was declared. And in a stunning twist of history, the first chancellor of this new, free Austria was none other than Karl Renner, Erzi's old mentor from the 1920s, the man who had guided her into the Socialist Party. The Social Democratic Party was back. It seemed for a moment that the red dream might be rekindled. Erzi and Petzneck tried to re-enter the world they had left behind. In 1948, Elisabeth's divorce from Prince Otto von Windisch-Graetz was, at long last, finally finalized. After a quarter-century of being together, in a quiet, simple ceremony, Elisabeth Marie, 65 years old, married Leopold Petzneck. It was the culmination of her life's great love story, a final act of peace after a lifetime of war. But the world had changed. And this is perhaps the final and most sophisticated irony of Elisabeth's life. The Socialist Party she returned to was not the radical revolutionary Marxist Party of 1920. The Austrian Civil War and the horrors of Nazism had taught them a different lesson. The new Socialist Party was pragmatic, cautious, and centrist. Its new goal was not revolution, but coalition. It wanted to share power with the conservatives to rebuild the country and most importantly, to navigate the terrifying new reality of the Cold War, with Soviet troops occupying half the city. Elisabeth and Leopold Petzneck were suddenly ghosts at the feast. They were Die Rote Erzherzogin and her red husband. They were relics of the old left, the radical, uncompromising revolutionaries from the days of the class struggle. Their brand of fiery, pure Marxism was now an embarrassment, a liability. The party respected them as elders, as survivors, as symbols, but it quietly, politely sidelined them. This was the ultimate, most quiet, and most devastating betrayal. She had survived the emperor, the fascists, and the Nazis, only to see her own revolution pass her by, deeming her too radical. Leopold Petzneck was given a ceremonial role as the president of the Freunde der Kinderfreunde, a children's welfare organization, but he was kept far from any real power. Erzi, for the first time in her life, simply stopped. She had nowhere left to fight. She retreated with Petzneck into their villa in Hütteldorf. The woman who had been at the center of a half-century of European history, who had secretly funded revolutions and openly defied dictators, now lived the one life she had never known, a quiet one. She tended her garden. She read her books. She lived as a simple private citizen, the wife of the man she loved. This quiet, simple peace, the only peace she had ever known, lasted until 1956. In that year, Leopold Petzneck, his health permanently shattered by his 7 years in the concentration camps, died. With his death, the fire in Elisabeth finally went out. She was 73 years old, and now for the first time truly and completely alone. She lived on for 7 more years, a recluse in her villa. The Red Archduchess was now just a quiet old woman, a forgotten legend in a city obsessed with this new economic miracle and its Cold War anxieties. The waltzes had returned to the opera houses, and the tourists were back, but she was no longer a part of that world. She was a living ghost, a relic of an imperial past and a revolutionary one with no place in the present. On March 16, 1963, Archduchess Elisabeth Marie, comrade Elisabeth Petzneck, died quietly in her home. She was 79 years old, the warrior princess who had defied empires, the revolutionary who had survived fascists and Nazis, the woman who had lived a life of such intense, violent, and passionate extremes, did not die from a revolutionary's bullet or a political intrigue. She succumbed in the end to arteriosclerosis. She died of old age and obscurity. Her death was a minor story in the Viennese papers, a curiosity from a bygone age. But the Red Archduchess had one final explosive act of defiance left, her will. When her last will and testament was read, it was her final shot, fired from beyond the grave at the system she had fought her entire life. She had 4 children, her lost children, who had all grown up in the aristocratic world of their father, Prince Otto. They had married into other aristocratic and noble families, restoring the very blue blood lineage she had rejected. They were, no doubt, expecting to inherit her still considerable fortune, the last remnants of the Habsburg and Belgian royal wealth. Elizabeth left them almost nothing. In her will, she made her final statement. She bequeathed the vast majority of her entire estate, her villa, her lands, her art, her fortune, not to her biological family, but to the Republic of Austria. She specified it was to be used for the public good, for the welfare of the people, a final donation to the socialist cause she had given her life to. Her children were outraged. They immediately contested the will, launching a bitter public legal battle against the state, claiming their mother was mentally unfit, that she was unduly influenced, that she was insane. The legal battles dragged on for years, a final sad and pathetic echo of the family conflict that had defined her entire life. But in the end, her will was largely upheld. Her final act of class treason was a success. Her successor in spirit, the thing she fought for, was, in many ways, the modern Austrian welfare state. The ideas of Red Vienna, public housing, universal health care, workers' rights, became the bedrock of the new post-war Austria, creating one of the most stable and equal societies in the world. Her ideals, in a pragmatic, diluted form, won. But Elisabeth Marie's life had ended. The true battle over her story, the Red Archduchess versus the cursed Habsburg, was just beginning. The world she left behind was one of the most profound, tragic, and powerful ironies in modern history. Her entire life was a chain reaction, set off by that single desperate gunshot in the Mayerling hunting lodge in 1889. That one act of violence, born of her father's despair at the Old Guard, defined her. It stole her childhood, it fueled her rage, it forged her into a revolutionary, and it set her on a path to tear down her grandfather's world. She was the ultimate princess of what could have been, but she was also a testament to the fact that one's world is not always chosen. It is often inflicted. Elisabeth Marie was a woman who dared to take the profound personal trauma of her past and forge it into a weapon for political change. She proved in the most dramatic way possible that even the bluest blood in Europe could turn a defiant, passionate, and revolutionary red. But she also proved that the cost of such a war is almost always everything you have.